Good afternoon. I'm thankful to the people who organized this convention, and I'm honored to be lecturing to fellow organologists, musicologists, ethnomusicologists. I think some of you may know my work in Africa and India, but organology has always been an interest of mine too. And most recently, I've been working on the contributions of a man named Elisha Gray to the history of music. Some of you may know his name. He was an inventor. He invented the musical telegraph, which we're talking about today. He also invented the telephone. Some of you may think of Bell when you think of telephone. Gray and Bell were exact contemporaries. They filed their patents on the same day. The short story is that Bell won all the court cases that resulted from that, and so we don't know Gray's name as well, but he was an inventor of the telephone. He also invented something called the telautograph. I just have to mention this, that after his work with the musical instruments, he put his mind to the telautograph, which was a fax machine. It could duplicate anything you drew with a pencil or wrote, send it over the telegraph wire, and it would be received in real time with a receiving machine. Anywhere it could be hooked up to a telegraph. Amazing achievement. Anyway, this talk is about his musical activities, though. I have with me here several items. These are replicas of devices built by Gray. I was fortunate enough to see the electricity collections at the Smithsonian, where a large number of his devices reside safely. And by the way, you should, if you know of anything that you want to look at the Smithsonian, please ask. They're very helpful. So what I have here are replicas because you can't actually hook up the electricity items. So in order to hear them, we had to build some. And I had the help of several people: Bill Moeller, electronics specialist in the physics department, Mike Miller, machinist in the physics department, and John Talbert, who built computer music instruments. And just to briefly give you a little tour here, this is a violin with a metal plate attached. Gray built this early on in his inventing career when he was getting into electrophonics. He used it as a loudspeaker, kind of proto-loudspeaker. I'll say more about it in the question and answer session if people are interested. He also built a real loudspeaker. I think this is the first one in the world. Metal bowl and electromagnets picking up a sound and reproducing it. And he built this loudspeaker with a wooden box, same idea, electromagnets. He hooked up organ pipes with electric pickups to send that sound over the telegraph. And just in the background there, you see a battery, gravity cell battery. That was the common device used to power everything in his day, including the telegraph system itself. So that's just for reference there. And then he built the musical telegraph. This is the musical telegraph. It was a keyboard that communicated sounds it produced with metal reeds that were set in motion with electromagnets. And they were reproduced on a loudspeaker, whichever one you hooked up, this one or another one that I'll show you in my slide program. And I will play these instruments before we're finished here today. So let me begin with a slide presentation. So Elisha Gray lived in the 19th century. It was a typical Victorian era man, 1835 to 1901. He was a professor. In addition to being an inventor, he taught at Oberlin College for 30 years. He attended Oberlin College originally, and he also wrote a wonderful book called Nature's Miracles, still wonderful to read. So quite an accomplished man in many ways. So here's the mystery example I'd like to play. I did this with my classes all the time, play an example that we hadn't heard that we're about to talk about. So mystery example to start off my talk. So that was performed by my colleague, Claudia MacDonald. The tune, of course, is Home Sweet Home. Some of you may not know that tune, but it was very big in the 19th century. She was playing it on this keyboard. However, she was confining her playing to 16 notes. That'll be obvious why she did that as we go along here. This is our imagination of what Gray's equipment might have sounded like, synthesized by John Talbert. We never will hear the actual equipment unless we get permission from the Smithsonian someday in the future. And of course, recording industry hadn't even emerged at his time. So we have to do a bit of imagination here. So to set the scene a little more with this 19th century phenomenon, let me move to my next slide, which shows a famous person, Jenny Lind. She was known as the Swedish Nightingale. She came to America in 1850, sponsored by P.T. Barnum. She was already famous in Europe, knew all the musicians and good friends with Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. And she was a fabulous success. And her success actually, I think, helped frame the 19th century American audience. She sang arias from operas. She sang Swedish folk songs. She sang American folk songs, American popular songs like Home Sweet Home, kind of her theme song. And this is what audiences loved and came to expect. And so into this setting, we are immersing ourselves as best we can. Of course, in those times, you always went to a concert if you wanted to hear music, or you made your own music. There was no industry that got the music to you any other way. Today, we're very much used to sitting in a concert hall with maybe nothing happening because the sounds are coming over loudspeakers created by computers. This is very much standard for us nowadays. So I have a question for you as we get rolling here. When do you suppose this phenomenon began? And the second question, did the electric light or electric music come first? So while you're pondering that, let me move to the answer to that first question. The first concert without anyone in the audience was this concert put on by Elisha Gray. Some of you may have thought of Cahill and his telharmonium, magnificent instrument that was heard over loudspeakers in halls and in hotel lobbies. But that was the 1890s. We're in 1874 here, December 29th. We're at the Presbyterian Church in Highland Park, Illinois, where Gray and his wife lived at the time. And they're putting on a concert with the electric telephone. This is what Gray was calling his equipment. Remember, he hadn't invented the speaking telephone yet, so he was using this to describe this instrument. He claimed that at this concert, we were going to hear familiar melodies transmitted from a distance through telegraph wire, and they will be received upon violins and other instruments within the room. Those are the instruments I was showing you there. So the audience sat in the church. They saw this pine box speaker sitting at the front. This is the actual item, by the way, at the Smithsonian that was used, now at the Smithsonian, was used at the Highland Park concert. You can imagine my thrill seeing this after doing some research on it. And that's why I built my own replica of it so that we could see it and hear it. So the sounds coming out of this loudspeaker were coming from somewhere else, a mystery performer somewhere else. Sorry, I had to put that in. It shows my enthusiasm for everything that I was doing at the Smithsonian about 4 years ago. So I'd like to just quickly go through some of the keyboards that Gray built, all of which could be called the musical telegraph in one form or another today. This is his patent model. He filed a patent about 2 years after that concert. It had only 8 keys. The black keys are just painted on there. It had electromagnets and steel reeds. I'll give you a closer look here. This is one mounted on a plaque by itself, the steel reed, electromagnet powered by a battery. Power that electromagnet, it pulls the reed, but it also cancels the power. And so the reed returns to its position, and then it is once again attracted by the magnet. And the frequency of that is determined by the way you build the reed, the pitch that it's tuned to. So you get that pitch every time you press a key. This is the patent diagram. Here are the reeds pointing down. They're loose ends attracted by the electromagnets. You pressed a key, the electric circuit is closed here. I have a circuit diagram, which I won't take time to explain it all, but again, we can answer questions if you're interested. So how did Gray get started with all of this? Well, everyone who was working in electricity and sound in this day was indebted to Helmholtz. Everyone's heard of Helmholtz. He was a physician in Germany, and he wrote this famous book on the sensations of tone, 1863. It appeared in German originally. Gray would have read it in German. Incidentally, ethnomusicologists might be surprised to see Alexander Ellis's name there, the inventor of the sense system for describing intervals. He was the translator of the English version. Anyway, Helmholtz, in this book, in addition to talking about the physiology of music and the sensation of tone, psychological implications, that sort of thing, described something he built called a device for compounding vocal timbres. You could say this is the first electric synthesizer, but it wasn't a musical instrument. It was for producing, replicating the sound of tones that when you speak, vowel sounds, right? He used an electromagnet to get this tuning fork in motion. There are many of them here. And then depending on which resonator, these are called Helmholtz resonators to the day, which resonator you invoked, you would replicate by adding the overtones of the fundamental, an oo or an ah or an e. And this was very interesting to everyone working with electricity and sound. So Gray took this idea and built his machinery with reeds instead of tuning forks. This was all part of telegraphy, believe it or not. I mean, musical details came in, but it began with telegraphy. This is Samuel F.B. Morse demonstrating his telegraph when it was first made practical in 1844. Gray, incidentally, was just a boy at that time, and he was fascinated with it and built his own little model that worked, and got into electricity as soon as he could. Attended Oberlin College, where he studied physics and so on. So he was very much in telegraphy for his inventive career. Here's a company he founded, Gray and Barton in Cleveland. They built all kinds of equipment. This is a printing telegraph, one of their early achievements. This company, by the way, was later named Western Electric. That's a name you'll see in the title pages of old vintage Hollywood movies, you know, think about that. He founded that company. So telegraphy was at a kind of crisis point 30 years into its life in Gray's day, and that was depicted here. Every telegraph message had to be sent on a wire, and you could only send one at a time. And so the proliferation began. This is a later picture, but this is what was happening in the 1870s already. So multiplexing was the issue of the day. Gray had his answer for this. He was going to send a telegraph message, not just on a clicking device, but on a tone. And if you set up a second device with a different tone, you could send two messages at once. He did this with 8 messages, actually, at the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876. Western Union strung a line between Philadelphia and New York for him to demonstrate that he could send 8 messages at once over this single wire. He had 4 operators in Philadelphia, 4 in New York, all with their separate tones. They all sent their messages at once. They were all received by 8 more people. Quite an amazing accomplishment. I mention this because that single wire was very important for the history of music, we'll discover. So as we're seeing here, Gray was very much involved in telegraphy, but I wanted to bring in his wife at this point, Delia Shepard. The two of them met when they were students at Oberlin. She was a music student, and I firmly believe, even though there's no documentation of this, that she was very much behind his efforts to do something musical with telegraphy, because she was interested in music. She was involved with the music scene. Maybe she put together his programs. Maybe she was playing the keyboard at the Presbyterian Church at that event in 1874. So she deserves the credit for that, I think, even though we don't have it documented. So what happened next? A few more keyboards, and then we'll get to that subject. I just want to make sure we've seen all of his keyboards that are held at the Smithsonian. This is another 1-octave model. It had probably earlier than the patent model. It had little thin reeds and big magnets. Then he built the 2-octave model that you saw me handling briefly there. Inside it were 24 reeds with only 12 electromagnets. Quite an accomplishment. I assume it sounded fine, but it was eclipsed by the other equipment he built. Finally, this is what I call his keyboard number 4. This we don't have anymore. I'll show you a replica that I made, but based on this picture. This picture is from 1877, a couple of years after the Presbyterian Church concert. And I'll say quite a lot about the event, but just look at the instrument first. We have 16 chromatic tones here. The black keys work too. The mechanisms have been removed into the case underneath. And here are the batteries. We heard close the doors on the case, and we still hear it on the resonator. You saw it there on top here, just here. So this man is sitting in Philadelphia. And the next part of the story is that here's Gray emceeing a big concert with this Mr. Boscovitz playing, but he's in New York. He's standing here on the stage. He's got his new loudspeaker. It has 16 pipes. Each one has a ribbon, metal ribbon inside that's responding to the 16 notes on the keyboard. Ingenious device. I won't try to explain it in too much detail. But you know, here is what it looked like inside each of those pipes. But I want to make the point here that this man, although it looks like he's playing an instrument, he's just the telegrapher communicating with the with Mr. Boscovitz in Philadelphia. Play now, we're ready. And when the concert was, the first item was over, he'd say, people liked it, play the next tune. You know, it was, but there was nothing actually happening on stage. So this is your first empty stage concert, you could say. So here's the 16-note replica I made of the instrument, musical telegraph number 4, you could say. And here's a closer look at these pipes as pictured there, each one with its resonating reed inside. So how did this all take place? Well, here's how we know it took place without details. Mr. Strakos, shown here, was the entrepreneur at the Steinway Piano Company's concert hall. It was called Steinway Hall. It was inside this building in New York. And it seems the only possibility here is that he heard about Gray's concert at the Presbyterian Church. Gray was, I don't think, involved in promoting this his own. He was inventing, he was working on things. But Strakos got behind this. He hired Boscovitz. He employed some other musicians to play and put on this gala concert. Turned out there were a series of concerts, actually. And here's the program from it. You can see here now why I chose Home Sweet Home. It was just at the top of the list all the time in the 19th century. So these pieces were played by Boscovitz, and the audience liked it very much. They praised it. It was written up nicely in many newspapers. Here's a better look at the actual event. The answer to my first question, my second question earlier was what came first, electric music or electric lights? Music was first. Here we are in Steinway Hall. This is gas lighting, not electricity. That's a trivia question that not many people know the right answer to. Here again, we've got the pipes on the piano, the telegrapher communicating with the performer in Philadelphia, the audience listening in New York. It's like a seance, must have been. Nobody performing, and yet we're hearing music. So just to give you some idea of the success of it, he went on and gave the same concert at the Brooklyn Academy of Music. The telephone surprised and charmed the large audience which listened to its magic strains last evening. No one doubted that the telephone is one of the wonders of modern science and destined to be an instrument of practical use. And there were other reviews like this. The person at this concert, at the first one, described it like this. Presently, the familiar tones of Home Sweet Home were heard, proceeding from nowhere in particular. So they're quite amused by this phenomenon, as we would have been too. But this same reviewer went on to make a point that Gray pretty well knew, but proceeded anyway. And that is, this person assessed this bit of equipment as follows. Unless an almost incredible improvement be effected, it is difficult to see how the transmission of music over the new instrument can be of permanent or practical value. Gray knew this, as I said. I mean, 16 notes, we need 88, right? And a lot of research and development had to go into that. He was more interested in moving on to the Telegraph and so on. And so he retired the instrument after one more performance at First Church in Oberlin. He was invited back to his alma mater for an honorary degree in 1878. And here he had a pianist in Cleveland. The audience sat in the hall of First Church in Oberlin. And then he retired the instrument, as I said. But he'd made his mark. He'd shown that electricity can be the handmaiden of music. It can be used to produce music and to reproduce it. And now I'd like to turn to the actual equipment we have, so you can hear it. And then we're just about done here. So the musical telegraph keyboard, those reeds inside sound like this when we play a note. Bottom note. Pretty raucous, pretty loud. It's lower in pitch than Gray's, where his instruments were pitched about a fifth higher than this. But remember, this was not the sound that the audience heard. This was encased in the cabinet. Even the player heard it on the pine box instead. And the point of that sound was to get a sound over the telegraph wire, electroacoustic phenomenon there, and reproduce it at the other end with a loudspeaker. So I'm not really in a position to play a nice tune for you on this keyboard, unfortunately, because some of the notes are out of tune and it's rather difficult to work with. I praise Mike Miller for the achievement he did, but we don't want to push him too hard on making it even more perfect. It's good as it is. So what I have here is a demonstration just of the sound of what it sounded like in the audience room when they were listening on the pine box speaker. So this is the actual speaker, which I recorded here in my house. But before we do that, let me show you the insides briefly. So with the lid off, here are the electromagnets, and here's the back with the reed showing, deep toned reed here and the higher one here. They're open, loose ends are facing up in this instrument, and we can see here electric contacts on both sides. So electroacoustics working here. We've got an acoustic sound. The contacts are picking up that sound and sending it over the telegraph wire as an electric signal to be reproduced in the reverse process at the other end. So on this loudspeaker, here is what we might hear. This is a recording I made, as I said, just a little demo. It's not an actual tune, but we will hear it as it sounded by itself. So to end, I want to try to replicate a fragment of Gray's final concert. Here we are in the meeting hall of First Church. Gray would have probably used his pine box speaker, setting it here, and people listened to the performer who was in Cleveland playing Maybe he was playing The Last Rose of Summer. So let's listen to Claudia McDonald playing again here, and then we're finished. Okay, thank you, Claudia. One last slide, just listing some of the things I've written. The most detailed write-up is in the Galpin Society Journal here, all the circuitry and the other accomplishments that Gray did musically, and so on. I'll make this available as a PDF. So with that, I could say we're done, and I look forward to answering your questions.